Hey, friends and listeners of the Switch for Good podcast. Yep, that's you. I have some really exciting news. Dotsie and I have started a Switch for Good podcast Facebook group. We created it so we can build a community of fans that will help us improve the show and deliver on the topics that you want to learn more about. So we want to hear what your favorite content is, what you want more of, and what you want less of. And if you like the length of the show, Dotsie and I are always talking about the length of the show, right, Dotsie?
Yes.
We want to tailor our show around the needs and desires of our incredible listeners, almost 500,000 of you. And it's really simple to join. Just go to our Switch for Good Facebook page. That's Switch, the number 4, and then Good. And then click on groups. And there we are, the Switch for Good podcast chat. You can post directly in the group, share ideas, talk to other listeners, and connect with like-minded folks. So go, run, join our Facebook group and tell us what you want.
Welcome out there. Welcome to the Switch for Good podcast. We are stoked to have you back with us. And today is a special occasion because I have the honor of introducing my friend and an extraordinarily kind human being, Rich Roll. Rich is a father and a husband, but most of you will recognize his grounding voice from his weekly masterclass in personal and professional development, the Rich Roll podcast. From a promising Stanford swimmer to desperate entertainment lawyer caught in the vicious cycle of alcohol abuse, Rich hit rock bottom and used the power of plants and endurance to catapult his life into one of abundance. Between completing the Epic 5 challenge to writing his best-selling memoir, Finding Ultra, Rich has amassed a life of experiences far beyond the average lifetime. He now dedicates himself to being a facilitator of growth and wellness through the Rich Roll podcast, which he launched in 2012. Rich is a true original, a multifaceted individual with a bounty to share, and we can't wait to get into it. So welcome to the Switch for Good podcast, Rich.
It's so nice to be here. You guys, I'm really honored and touched. And after that introduction, I have a feeling it's going to be all downhill. I should
Don't say that.
I need that bio. You just wrote my new bio. Like, that was beautiful. Like,
I can send it to you.
Embarrassed hearing that. So thank you.
You betcha. I'm going to go a little bit deep from the get-go. Alexandra and I are always batting back and forth. I like to go super deep, and she likes facts and figures and how do I change things and give me habits. So you're going to get the mixed bag from the two of us.
Good mix.
Everybody gets what they want out of this podcast. But I like talking about suffering. When I was on your podcast, we talked a lot about suffering. And you have a profound ability to suffer. But initially, that obviously seemed to work against you. You had to hit nearly rock bottom, not nearly, to pull yourself out of the hole. So how does one distinguish between suffering that will benefit you in the long run and suffering that's dragging you down?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I don't know. I'm still trying to figure that out, honestly, because I think for me, suffering has been a great teacher in all its forms. Like, I learned pretty early on that if I was willing to suffer in the swimming pool, that I could bridge a talent deficit gap and be able to hang with people who were clearly more talented than me. Mm-hmm. And I think learning that early created this association that suffering is good, or the more that I could develop my capacity to suffer, the more way I could make myself in the world. And so it was always kind of a good thing and something that I prided myself on, and has, of course, taken me to, some pretty great places. But because I have a very high tolerance for suffering, I'm willing to, entertain the dark side of that as well. So like everything, like all energy, there's two sides to the coin. And, whereas suffering has taught me in ways that have benefited me, it's also been a teacher in, how to dance with the devil as well, which is its own learning experience. And, I've done enough internal work to not regret those experiences, but try to learn from them, because all things, I think, are material for learning and growth. But certainly, suffering can be a bad thing too. So how do you distinguish, like where is the dividing line between good suffering and bad suffering. I think that's going to be different for different people, but I think ultimately, if you are somebody who has developed even a modicum of capacity for self-reflection and doing some of, the kind of internal work, whatever that looks like for you, then in your gut, like, is this something I really should be doing? Or is this making my life better? Or is this moving me in a direction that is away from the things that I care about or my core value system? So I think being in the habit of always being in that inquisitive state and asking yourself those questions is kind of a helpful divining rod in figuring out whether it's good suffering or bad suffering.
Yeah.
So you were able to excel because of your capacity in terms of physical suffering. But alcoholism, and Dotsie mentioned this in the intro, and your book, Finding Ultra, tells it in searing detail, your journey through that. Being an alcoholic is often running away from emotional suffering. So do you think that you have more of a capacity to deal with the physical, but the emotional, so the physical overcomes the emotional suffering, and you prefer to suffer that way? Because I think a lot of people also ask, is Rich Roll an ultra athlete because he's just taking one addiction to another, and maybe still covering up that emotional suffering?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's certainly some truth to that. I think I would be disingenuous if I said absolutely not. There's nothing addictive about being an ultra endurance athlete. Like, the ultra endurance world is filled with people in recovery, because that population of people like myself are of the mind that more is always better, or further, farther, like, however you can push the limit in various aspects of your life is like a moth to the flame, right? So certainly there is an addictive piece in there. And if you're not careful, I think your relationship with, sports or other things can become unhealthy in that regard. So that's another kind of inquiry that I'm always making. Is this a healthy relationship? Is this moving my life forward in a positive direction? Or is this me running away from something and hiding behind the veil of a socially approved behavior, or perhaps a behavior that I get rewarded for, which makes it even more enticing to hide behind? And, that I think can be tricky, because like you said, like, I am an alcoholic in recovery, and I'll always be an alcoholic in recovery. And I am somebody who is very attracted to more, like, how can it be bigger and better? And that can be pursued in the physical realm, but it can also be pursued in the emotional realm. Like, if you feel like you're a piece of shit and you aren't worth anything, then, let's push the envelope in this behavior that isn't necessarily physical, but is very extreme, as a way of creating emotional punishment for yourself, because you feel like you're deserving of that. Like, that's kind of like the dark, side of what that kind of emotional disposition can look like without tools and, everything that I've learned in recovery.
I'm wondering what you think about if consumption kind of begets consumption. I'm reading for the second time, because every single word is so powerful, Joan Halifax's book, Engagement. And in there's a part where she's speaking to a doctor, and he's talking about that consumption makes for more consumption, even when it is completely unpleasant. And they did this experiment on rats, which I wish they hadn't done that, but they did, where they fed them saline water, which I guess is they don't normally like, and it's bad for them.
Mm-hmm.
And even though it was making them sick, they kept coming back. And I thought, it just kind of the core of it, if you were to say it's almost the simplistic nature, because there's always simplistic part of everything and a complex part of everything. With my anorexia, I felt there at the end, before I got help, probably that full last year, where I was like addicted to the consumption of it. And it just kept getting worse and worse and pushing more and more, not for any other reason that it had become a consumption habit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think if you're consuming something, behind that, there's some drive that's compelling that behavior, and you're getting something out of it. There's a inherent reward system with that, whether it's a dopamine hit or whatever it is. Like you're seeking it out for a reason, right? And you're getting that little bump. But as you kind of inure yourself to more and more of that, you need a bigger bump, and you're going to constantly, chase that dragon, seeking more and more and more, because you're not getting that reward stimulus that you initially got at the beginning of that, adventure, right? So yes, it's always going to beget more and more and more until ultimately you reach some crisis point with it, where you're compelled to reflect on your behavior and modify it. Otherwise, you'll continue your whole life doing that. And we see that in various forms, in our culture, because if you can still keep your life together while you're kind of chasing that thing and things aren't completely falling apart, you can persist in that for the remainder of your life without ever enough self-reflection or awareness to realize that it's an empty pursuit.
Yeah.
Your tolerance for, like we've been talking about, meant that when you were in rehab, they told you that you were like a 65-year-old alcoholic, even though you were a 33-year-old. How
31.
31-year-old. What did you learn in rehab that really clicked with you after so many years, a little more than a decade of drinking?
Well, I learned that I had a disease, that I wasn't a bad person, but that I was somebody who had an affliction, and that affliction is both a physical disposition as well as a spiritual dilemma. And I learned a whole box full of tools for how to manage what got me into that situation to begin with. And those tools are both very practical and tactical, but also very ephemeral and spiritual in that regard. And I learned that, this is a condition that I'm going to have to live with, but that it is solvable. And the solution doesn't end with the removal of drugs and alcohol. That's actually the beginning. Like, it was a big epiphany to me to come into an understanding that the disease isn't removed with abstinence. That's when the work begins, because it's my underlying emotional condition that needs constant redress. Because when you remove the drugs and the alcohol, that's sort of like the solution until it stops working. And then when you take that away, you're left with no tools and no ability to manage your life and your emotional state. And that's where these tools have become critical and remain to this day, like the core principles upon which, I premise my life and make decisions, and kind of, it's an organizing principle around which, makes my life functional.
What did you find out about yourself? What was at the core? What was the pain and the agony and the angst that turned you to a drink?
I think it was a sense of worthlessness and a belief that I didn't belong, and a conviction that I didn't deserve good things, and that bad things would always happen to me. And this deep-seated desire to feel connected to other people. Like, a big part of my drinking was fueled by this discomfort in my own skin. And if I could have some drinks, I could be with other people and feel like I was a part of something. So it was a loneliness, I think, and an insecurity that seemed to be ameliorated when using. But then when you take that cure away, you're like this, like loose end, like this live wire that doesn't know what to do with himself. It's almost, it's worse until it gets better. So I learned that I wasn't a broken person, and that there was nothing, fundamentally wrong with me that couldn't be healed. And that healing process has been a journey of, a journey towards wholeness that has compelled me to look in the rearview mirror and identify my fears and my resentments and how I've, misused sexuality, which provides this clear picture of kind of your general tendencies. And that kind of fills in the colors on this story, that you believe about yourself. It puts it to the test and kind of shows you the lie behind that. And then you have all of these tools for rectifying all of these things that have fueled those resentments and fomented those fears so that you can be released of them. And some of them are very practical, like doing a personal inventory and making amends to people and the like. And others, like I said earlier, are very ephemeral. It's like forgiveness and, prayer and meditation and, these spiritual principles and tools that, that are kind of, part and parcel of the entire program that go with all of the kind of practical stuff.
So do you still go to meetings on a regular basis, or do you practice these things yourself in your own life without going to meetings?
Yeah, no, I go to meetings. I mean, during the COVID period, most of the meetings went to Zoom. So that's become like more of a Zoom experience, and they're starting to, some of them are starting to go back to normal. So, in all candor, like my meeting attendance dropped off over the last year and a half. But certainly it's still the number one priority in my life. And I'm, very much a member of the 12-step community here in LA.
Yeah. You just said something about making amends with people. And I think that maybe, gosh, that could be one of the greatest pains of all of us wandering around, is those times where we made missteps. And last year I had a couple of ex-employees sue me for some things that they just made up. And I have been racking my soul since then. It was just, I don't know, it felt horrible at the time. And I cannot put together how I might reach out in kindness and with compassion and with wholeness and with the desire to make amends. Part of it is I can't imagine what that looks like. And maybe I need to do that. What were your steps when you went back and said, there's some amends that I need to make?
Well, sure. I mean, first of all, it's identifying your part in the equation or in the dynamic that led to the conflict.
Yeah.
And regardless of any kind of conflict that any of us find ourselves in, it's very easy to say that person was entirely wrong and look at how awful they are. And you get your friends to say you're right and they're terrible and all of that. But when your head hits the pillow at night, you kind of know how you might have contributed to it. So I think the first part is like getting really
and I know
clear.
how I would have done it differently too. Which is
right. And then carrying that around for a long time has this like psychic drain, right? Like even if in the balance of things, like they were more wrong than you, still you have your part, and holding on to that is holding you back. And so the amends process is about identifying your part in it, and then figuring out how to not only apologize for that piece, but to actually undertake actions to make it right to the best of your ability, not in a way that's going to unduly harm you or harm other people, but if there's a way that you can course correct it, and then in your daily life moving forward outside of those other people to conduct yourself with a living amends, to like, I'm not going to behave that way anymore. I'm not going to get myself into those situations. I'm not going to engage in the behavior that led me to behave in that particular way in that instance, is kind of like the core, idea behind it. And they're hard, and it's very scary to approach somebody with whom you've had a conflict, especially when there's a lot of emotions around it. And the manner in which you do it is you go in without expectations, and you don't say, here's what I did, but you did this. Like, you just like, here's what I did. This was not right. Like, I want to make it right. Here's how I'm going to make it right. And they either accept that or they don't. It's none of your business whether they forgive you or not, but you're cleaning up your side of the street. And so the whole point is, the more that you can clean up your side of the street, tidy up, past stuff that has that kind of, subconscious anchor, on your soul, the freer you are, the more comfortable you are in your own skin, the easier it is to look people in the eye. And over time, you begin to, inhabit this more fully actualized version of yourself that makes you more productive, happier, more functional. And, in a kind of woo-woo spiritual way, like, honestly, when you are living, that kind of life, like, things work out better, like doors open, people want to be around you. There's something undefinable about it that I've experienced and have seen in other people. That's, nothing short of magical, but also, extremely real.
That's beautiful. I've been on both ends. Rich, I was in therapy for 12 years for my eating disorder. A month after getting into Overeaters Anonymous, I stopped throwing up and then went through the 12 steps and it was amazing how, yes, the therapy was important, but the actual actions that the 12 steps asks you to do are incredibly powerful. You've changed so much over your book talks about this transformation, which is why it's so inspiring. And so many, and then it became a bestseller. I'd like to talk about your relationship with Julie, your wife, who sounds like an extraordinary person. She was alongside you when you were recently sober. I think you got together with her about a year after you had gotten sober or gotten out of the rehab. And then she saw your evolution from being sober, but translating that pain into maybe eating, and you became you were still sedentary, overweight, not very happy as a lawyer. And then you transformed into the fittest man on earth in your 40s and a very successful podcast. This kind of change in one person is not only extraordinary for a lifetime. Congratulations. I mean, it is so inspiring, but what does it do to a relationship? I heard you talk about how your wife first had detachment, and I'd like you to sort of expand on that and her personal love versus divine love, if you can share with our audience that, because I thought it was beautiful.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it is a really powerful story, and I think it's a potent lesson in relationship dynamics, in that, like, Julie was able to kind of hold this space for me to, like, elevate myself to a higher level of awareness and behavior. And the way that it kind of went down is super interesting, because you're correct. Like, I met Julie when I had about a year of sobriety. And, she was the first, like, healthy relationship that I had, because my relationship with drugs and alcohol was so intertwined with my relationship with the opposite sex. Like, it was very hard for me to separate those things. And so the first year of sobriety, it was impressed upon me that I should be celibate and not date and really work on myself so that I could be somebody who could be in a healthy relationship. And I took that to heart and seriously, but I met Julie right at the very tail end of that year. And that was that. And at the time, my focus and intention was on creating the strongest foundation of sobriety that I could, and also on repairing all of the wreckage in the real world that I created as a result of my drinking and using. And kind of behind that was this deep shame, because I had squandered a lot of opportunities. Like, I was somebody who was on a very, kind of upwardly mobile track. And I feel like I really destroyed a lot of that. And I was hell-bent on rebuilding it. And that created a bit of a tunnel vision for me, that translated into some workaholism and, me just deciding, like, I need to be a partner in this big law firm, not because that's what I wanted for myself, but because I felt like then my parents would say he's okay, or society would look upon me and forget about the whole alcoholism thing and say, he's the person who, I knew when he was 18 years old. So that was really driving me. And the backdrop was I meet Julie. Julie's, I meet her in a yoga class. She's super into spiritual growth and personal growth. She's eating really healthy. She's taking care of herself. She's reading lots of, empowering books. Meanwhile, like, I'm just like, I'm working hard, it's that kind of suffer mentality. Like, I'm just applying that to my professional life in a very, with a hard grip on it. And also medicating myself with food. Like, I couldn't do drugs anymore, but I can go to Jack in the Box and I can go to McDonald's and I can stay at the law firm super late and do all of that stuff. And I'm technically sober, but in early sobriety, it's not until, you're sober for a while and you start to realize that some of those behaviors like don't really fly with being a truly sober person. But I wasn't really in that space yet. And Julie, could see this. And I think she looked at me and said, I can see, like, this guy has there's so much inside of him that would be beautiful for him to express, but he's so like dense, like he's like stuck in his own way of thinking. And she would say to me, like, maybe you shouldn't go to Jack in the Box. Like, why don't you, like, I made some broccoli, or here's some stuff in the fridge, or, instead of watching Law and Order, like, why don't you read one of these books on the bedstand, and the more that she would do that, the more that I resisted. And this is kind of like the relationship piece. Like, if anybody who's been in any kind of relationship, perhaps can relate to that dynamic. If a partner is kind of like trying to push you in a certain direction, there's a natural resistance to resist that. And she wasn't like vibing me or really judging me. It was all very gentle. But the more she did that, the less likely it was that I was going to avail myself of any of those kind of healthy alternatives. And then, she kind of got to the point where she thought, like, well, this isn't working, and I don't see this guy really evolving in the way that I thought that perhaps he could. And she had to ask herself, like, if he just stays this way forever and never, evolves in any meaningful way, like, she's thinking of herself on this evolutionary path. Like, I'm always trying to grow and improve myself. If he's not, is that a guy that I still want to be with? And that's a hard thing to figure out. And ultimately she decided, yes, I love him. And, even if he doesn't change, like, I still want to be with him. And at that point she decided, well, if that's the case, then I need to let go of trying to will him to be anything other than who he is. And she didn't do that in a perfunctory way. Like, she actually meant it and started practicing it without telling me. But that created like a vacuum, because suddenly, like, all of that energy that I had acclimated towards was no longer there. And I think that was a really pivotal thing, because even without a conversation about this in any regard, I could feel that energy shift. And suddenly, rather than somebody else saying, you need to make a change, I was just left with myself. So when I looked in the mirror, I was like, well, no one's telling me I need to be any different. Then suddenly I find myself asking myself that question for maybe the first time. Like, is this okay with me? Is this how I want to live? Is this what I'm going to continue to do? And I think that precipitated a little bit of an existential crisis that trickled into how I was thinking about my professional career, not just the foods I was eating or the sedentary lifestyle that I'd been, kind of pursuing. And I think that continued to build until this kind of like staircase episode that I've spoken about many times, that catalyzed like a lot of the changes that have led me to, doing all the things that ultimately I ended up doing.
That was the episode when you were watching probably Law and Order, and you were going to bed and you walked up the stairs and you were completely gassed at the top. And it was like, hold on a minute. This is not.
I had, like winded by a flight of stairs. I mean, I'd been a swimmer at Stanford, and how denial works and like body image works. Like, you think you look a certain way when you look in the mirror, and there's a very different reality, but it takes some kind of externality to snap that, to like crack that denial and allow yourself to see yourself as the way that you really are. And that staircase incident was that clarity moment for me, which was not dissimilar from, hitting bottom with drugs and alcohol and having that moment of clarity that led me to going to rehab. And I realized like, I need to make some changes, and I need to kind of do it in the way that I did it with drugs and alcohol. Like, of course, being like, extreme, like I need to find, detox for lifestyle. And I kind of created that for myself.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk just to finish that thought about the difference between divine love and personal love?
Yeah, I mean, that's really a Julie question, but personal love is a beautiful idea, but ultimately personal love is transactional. Like you could say that you love somebody unconditionally, but that will only last until they do that thing that's just outside of bounds for you. Like whether they, rob a bank or steal a car or cheat on you. And then suddenly that unconditional love is very conditional, right? So that's really personal love. Like there is a transactional aspect to every human relationship. Divine love is very different. Divine love is like the sun shining on the earth. It's indiscriminate. Like it will shine everywhere. It doesn't matter who you are or what you did. It shines its light equally on everybody, and is very much the opposite of transactional and much more of a universal kind of thing. So the idea being like the more that you can embody what is best about like universal love, which means refraining from judgment and always seeing the best in others and being the first to, not only forgive others, but forgive yourself, are, pretty powerful guiding spiritual principles for how to live your life.
Yeah.
And that was the thing with Julie. Like, she's like, is this a divine love or is this a personal love? Like, if it's divine love, then who am I to judge this person's decisions about how he's living his life?
Right. Yeah. And that'll be hard to hear for people that just, went through maybe a brutal divorce, that the person would not stop sleeping with other people, because there's boundaries around, but it's a beautiful idea. And when you were speaking about, kind of the actions around the experience of loving someone else, there was what was a complete game changer for me was, I learned this in therapy, but really helpful, was just about every time, which is so much less often than it used to be, that I want to kill Kirk for whatever, is instantly say, okay, what is annoying to him about me from the last week? Like, what are the things? And I'm not being like, oh, that's so great. It was truly a practice that I got into from learning that. And every single time you're like, yeah, I'm not going to bring that up. He's awesome. He's a complete and total, the most intense workaholic I've ever met. And every time I'm like, really, are we going to do this till like 8 p.m? Can we just stop, whatever my ideas are of how I want to experience that moment, so, and he needs to be in my picture frame so I can have this, and he's working or whatever, but he truly is happy. I think what's the opposite? On the couch with a beer can, watching football, which I would die if that would not be my good match. That would make me want to just, I wouldn't be able to experience divine love. That's just awful. But that is the opposite. So when I would think of what the opposite is, it's like, okay, hey babe, can I bring you anything to eat up in the office while you're still working? And it ties into respect, right? Which is just so common that we all know. We've all been married for, I think I'm the newbie. I've been married for 18 and you guys are longer. I know Alexandra's longer. How long have you been married?
How long have we been married? Maybe I think 18 also. 2003 we got married. I've been with Julie since 2000. So we've been together for 21 years. Yeah. But I think it's what you just said is really interesting. I think you have to be careful though, that you're not, that doesn't lead you to harbor some kind of resentment that you're just repressing. A powerful practice that I like to do that might be helpful when you feel that annoyance cropping up, to go beneath the annoyance and say, well, why is that annoying me? Like, if this person is behaving in this way and I persistently feel annoyed with that, what is driving that annoyance? So in your particular case, I mean, I wouldn't know, you would know, but let's just say for the sake of argument, it's if he's working all the time, then I don't feel connected with him, or I feel like
I worry about him. I know what it is. I worry that he's not actually happy, because I'm not happy working 24/7. So I only have my own experience.
So
that's
you're projecting that.
Yep. Completely.
You're projecting that. And also, his happiness is not your business. It's not your job to make him happy. Only he can make himself happy. And your definition of happiness, may not meet up completely with his.
Yeah.
I've heard you call yourself a people pleaser, Rich.
Yes.
So you've had to learn that lesson, I guess, right?
Yeah. Are we doing good? Do you guys like me? Is this going well?
I have that same.
That's my goal.
Oh dear. Right.
So you went from an excellent athlete in high school and college to alcoholic to sober, but then eating a lot of junk food and gaining 50 pounds. So when you do things, Rich, you do it big. We've already established that. So you're now very healthy in a big way. You have a very successful podcast, a beautiful family life. How do you deal with some of the negative aspects that you brought over in your life now, where you're sober and you're not racing as much, right?
Yeah, no, I don't really race that much anymore. Negative aspects, you mean like how do I keep those negative tendencies at bay, or what do you mean specifically?
Yeah. How do you deal with some of the negative aspects of now doing things in a big way? Like, do you have desires to do things in a big way and you realize, you know what, this is not healthy, or maybe it is healthy? Tell me.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest one that I deal with now is that workaholism thing. Like, I feel like when I wake up every day, it's like, how do I spend my time? How can I be the most impactful to the most number of people, like carrying this message forward that I care about. And the podcast is really the main outlet for that. And I constantly find myself like overcommitting to things and filling up my calendar with too many things, and then complaining about how exhausted I am and how close to burnout I am. Like, I do that time and time again. Years and years and years of therapy and recovery, and oh, there's Rich, he's grinding again and complaining about how he's exhausted. Like, that's the thing that consistently comes up for me, because I take all of that other energy that maybe would find an outlet in training for a race or something like that, and I put too much of it into my work. And that's not to say that I don't make sure that my life is balanced in the important ways, but that's the weakness, I think, that is an Achilles heel for me that I always have to pay attention to. And so the things that I've done to counteract that, or to grow, beyond that, is to hire amazingly talented people, which is what we did this year, and really create a team so I can step back and participate in my life outside of the studio in more meaningful ways. I take a month off every January, so I'm getting ready to do that now. So those are things that I'm creating. I have to create an environment that's conducive to the healthier choice, because left to my own devices, I'm going to always pivot to that other thing. And I think it's driven by, you mentioned people pleasing. Like, there's certainly a people pleasing aspect of it. I'm still, an ambitious person with lofty goals, and I know how to work towards them. But at the same time, I've never felt more comfortable in my own skin. Like, I really do believe like I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And it doesn't need to be anything bigger or more than what it already is. And if I were to not wake up tomorrow morning, like, that would be, it was a life well lived. Mm-hmm. So, I have grown, but I also am very aware of how I can tip into some of these unhealthy behaviors that no matter what I do, are always like, it's whack-a-mole, as it's like, okay, I got this area of my life like in good shape and it's sorted out, and then it pops up over here. So, that's life. That's the way, that's the way it goes.
Yeah. It sounds like, from what I'm hearing, is very important for you to have a plan. Like, what you're saying, that you take January off, and there's very specific aspects to a plan that you have to implement, because the other, your default is the other. And I didn't realize how many people, there was a recent Gallup poll that showed that 48% of Americans say that they don't have the time to do what they actually want to do.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would have guessed it. I just thought, golly, that's, obviously half of us just are wandering around waiting for, when do we get to do what we actually want to do? What would be a good plan for someone listening who's like, yeah, that's me. I never get to do what I want to do. Because it feels very intentional if you're going to change that.
Yeah, I think it's a sticky wicket. It is about planning, but I also think it's about boundaries, right? For me, a big piece is boundaries, especially as a people pleaser who wants to say yes to everything and has a hard time or is fearful of saying no, because it might mean that someone might not look at me the way that I would like them to look at me. So learning how to set healthy boundaries, I think, is super important. And frankly, and I don't think this is going to be news to you guys, but if somebody says, I don't have time for this thing, they have time. It's just not a priority. And so why isn't it a priority? Like, if you were to chronicle how you spend your time in 15-minute increments over the course of a week, I think everybody would be astonished at all kinds of areas where time is wasted. So if you truly want to do something and you're not doing it, either it's not important to you, or you haven't prioritized it, or perhaps there's a block where you're afraid of doing it, because if you do indulge in that behavior, what does that mean? Like, that can be scary, I think, for a lot of people. And it's easier to just keep living your life the way that you're living it, rather than stepping outside of it. And I think we're, as human beings, creatures of habit. And once we've established a certain habit, breaking it, even to build in time to do something that you enjoy, can be intimidating or difficult.
I think also, I know that you learned in sobriety that to change, you have to have a concrete plan. And a lot of people don't plan ahead to make that time, because it's not going to just show up today. You have to actually, like you said, have boundaries and know a little bit about how you're going to react in the future. Like,
yeah, sure. I mean, I think you're definitely the structure, tactics, strategy person. Alexander, clearly, she's like, tell me about the plan.
Yeah. Stop brushing over it.
Yeah.
That's a question. I want to know how you plan now to, how you use planning to improve your life, actually.
I think planning is super important. And my relationship with planning and goal setting is I think it's critical to be really crystal clear on what it is that you're trying to accomplish. If you have a goal, to set a goal, and then to create metrics around it that are measurable, like putting it on a calendar in the distance, and then working backwards from that date to erect a structure that's conducive towards you achieving that goal. Like, I think all of those practical things are super important. Having accountability, like, who are you telling? Who are you letting into this dream that you have that can be a benefit to you? Who are your mentors? Like, what are you doing on a daily basis that's moving you or inching you forward towards that goal? All of that, I believe in wholeheartedly, but I also like to hold those things loosely. Like, I've learned to not be over regimented in holding on to goals and things I have to do every single day too tightly, because that creates like a tension and a rigidity that leads me to a level of unhappiness. Like, it doesn't really work for me. And the way that I kind of practice it on a daily basis is really out of like the James Clear Atomic Habits playbook. I don't know if you've read his book, but everybody should read that book, especially if you're like lighting up. I'm sure you love that book, right? It's about, it's not about, like in the athlete context, it's not about the huge workout, the super long ride that you did. It's about the tiny little things that you're doing every single day that seem like nothing in the moment, but ultimately accumulate to, shift your life and your perspective and your behaviors over time. So consistency, persistence, tiny actions, all the stuff that's not very sexy and isn't going to be something that you're going to put on Strava or post on Instagram, but are really the levers for change. And when I look at my life, like when you describe it, like, oh, you've made all these crazy changes and you've done all this stuff, like these things happened over such an extended period of time. Like I got sober at 31, I'm 55, like, and I still struggle with emotional sobriety. Like I'm not perfect in this in any regard. And I was sober like 10 years before I did my first Ultraman and like went vegan. And it was many years after that. It was a couple of years after that I did Epic 5. And then it was years after that I wrote my first book. And I've been podcasting for 9 years at this point. And I'd be terrified to go back and listen to episode 1. Like we learn in the doing, right? And I think a lot of people get intimidated by big goals and they want to know, like, if you're too wed to the roadmap and how am I going to get there? And I need all of these questions answered before I, embark on day one of this, then you're dead in the water. Like you have to hold on a little bit loosely, understand that you don't need all of those answers. All you need is what you need, what you're going to be doing today. And the answers you seek will be answered in time, but it's almost rigged to prevent you from understanding everything. Like you're not supposed to. What you're supposed to do is go on a journey, on an adventure. And the stuff that you're worried about today will get figured out if you have the faith and the conviction to simply just begin.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. You don't even sound like an extremist when you say, when you talk, because you sound so balanced about that. I think it's wonderful.
Yeah. I'm a reformed, I was going to say reforming extremist, I guess.
Is there still a time when you want to drink? Like yesterday or last year?
Very, very, very rarely. I mean, once in a very blue moon, like I'll be like, wow, that would be cool to like I'll be watching a movie and everyone's sitting around a pool having a drink. And I'm like, that looks nice. I wonder if I could do that. And then I'm like, yeah, but if I was there, I would have to have 3 drinks before I even went to that house where they're having that pool party. And then I would have to have, 10, I'd be the guy sneaking into the house looking for, when no one's looking. Like I have to play it out in my mind. And then I realize like immediately it's not the attractive scenario that that creates that kind of like impulse. And that helps make the craving go away. So the struggle really, the emotion, the sobriety struggle is really not about drinking as much as it is about, like I said earlier, like emotional sobriety. Like if I'm not practicing these steps and engaged in my community and calling my sponsor and doing all this stuff, I'll be, an asshole or short with somebody, or I'll find myself sitting around ruminating on all kinds of resentments. Like that's the toxic stew that is, sure to come if I'm not, in that kind of daily maintenance mode.
I'm just curious about that, about alcoholism, because my vice was anorexia. And so there wasn't a world where I could heal and I could just remove food, right? Like you can with alcohol and drugs. I am the same person I was, but I am a completely different, hopefully more evolved version, which you certainly seem to be. And I don't even know if you've traversed this, but would you be that person if you were at a pool party? Like, would you need 3 drinks to hang out anymore?
Yeah, I think yes and no. I probably wouldn't be needing the 3 drinks to show up But then the day after that happens, I'm certain to do this again. And then I probably would need that. Like, I think what happens is the difference is, and I'm so sympathetic to anorexia and disordered eating conditions, because abstinence is, a powerful way of putting distance between yourself and cravings. Like, if I had to have a couple beers every day, it would keep that triggering craving alive, right? So you have to live with that in a way that I don't. And I did have a relapse at 10 years. I went out for like a day and I was in an AA meeting that night. But after, treatment and thousands of AA meetings and who knows how many hours spent, sitting in rooms and, really focused on my sobriety, I found myself at a bar and was having a drink. And then I was like, oh, I need more. And I had like 5 beers in me in like 30 minutes. Like, it picked up like that. And it was like everything that I'd learned and all the pain that I had endured evaporated. And it's really a frightening, scary thing, which made me realize just how cunning and baffling and powerful this condition is, that it could take hold of me out of the blue like that and dismiss everything that I had, done to heal myself in an instant. And I think what was powerful about that was really right-sizing my ego and putting to bed any idea that like, oh, I'm over this, or I don't need to, continue to go to 12-step and do all of this annoying stuff because I've been sober for a long time and I can go to AA meetings and everybody looks at me like I know what the fuck is going on, and I know how to say the right thing and make people feel better. And there's like a pride and an ego, thing that happens. Like, oh, I go to the meeting and people know me and they're like, well, that guy's been sober, however long. And that got eliminated. I had to really, eat some humble pie. And that really reframed my relationship with recovery in a powerful way that has made my, program stronger ultimately. And that was, that was 10 years ago that happened.
I always say I'm a million miles away, but I could get there in a second.
Yeah.
That's how I look at it. Speaking of humble pie, there was a time, and I think this isn't an updated version of Finding Ultra, but there was a time when you and your family went through just, you lost all financial security, essentially, from being, you were a lawyer, a very successful entertainment lawyer with lots of nice things, and those basically were taken away. You had your cars repossessed. You couldn't pay for your garbage to be picked up. Tell us a little bit about that, and what did it teach you now? How are you a different person because of that experience?
Yeah, it was a very hard period of time that went on for a very long time. It was a good. I mean, the hardest part was about a 5-year period, but I think it was more like an 8-year period that started, when around the time, like prior to me even doing my first Ultraman. And you characterize like my legal career as being very successful. It wasn't. I was in a big law firm and got paid a salary. But then I went out on my own and I had different versions of being a solo practitioner and being in small partnerships. Which were, let's just say, less than successful. And then the more I got interested in like ultra endurance and all of that, the less attention I was paying to my law firm. And then the recession hit and money was very tight for a very long time, including after Finding Ultra came out. Like, I'd written this book, and even after that, I was like, okay, I'm not going to be a lawyer anymore. And I'm pursuing this new path with faith that the phone would ring and opportunities would arise, and they just didn't for a very long time. So yes, we had this financial dismantling that was very painful and emasculating. Also, talk about humble pie. Yeah. Like being somebody who has kids and feeling like you can't provide for them. And I mean, having your trash cans taken away because you couldn't pay the $80 or whatever. Like, it was, we had cars repossessed. It was really difficult. But the lesson in that was that it really tested Julie and I and our conviction about what we were doing. Like, we had to get really committed and really clear about whether this was the path that we wanted to pursue and what we were willing to sacrifice to do it. And it required a very deep conviction and faith that this would be okay. Like, we are on the correct path, even if we're not being remunerated for it right now. This is still right. And there were many times where I was like, this is insane. All our friends were saying, what are you doing? Like, you're crazy. You're going to lose your house. Like, this is bananas. Just go get a job in a law firm. Like, get back to it. Like, who do you think you're kidding? But trusting and believing that we hadn't undergone all of this for no reason, and that there was a purpose on the other side of it that we were being prepared for, kind of in a spiritual sense, was, the capacity that we had to develop. And I think it very easily could have blown up our marriage. And I think this type of situation does ruin a lot of relationships, but it ultimately brought us closer together, because we had to be, so simpatico with what we were doing. And it made us really connected with what is most important and what is not important. And we made peace with the idea that our house was going to get taken away from us. Ultimately, we were able to save it, but by all indications and logic, it didn't look like that was going to be the case. And we were like, okay, well, it's just a thing. Like, we'll be fine. And, would you go back and work a certain job that you hated just to stay living it where you live? And it's like, no. And so I think that's been very helpful. It was sort of a stoic practice of like, okay, like, we have our kids, we have our health, we're doing what we want to be doing. We're trusting that it's going to work out, even if society has a different idea of like, what that means. And ultimately now it's so interesting when everyone's like, oh, you have this successful thing and this is all working out and how amazing. I can promise you that for a long time, people were like, you people are out of your minds. And, like we were radioactive in social circles. So I always think back on that experience as like this crucible of strength that we were able to develop. It was like we were being burned so that we could emerge from that and hold a deeper resonance that we would not have been able to otherwise.
Did you start your podcast not too shortly after or during this time?
Mm-hmm.
And why did you start it? What was, I've never heard, like, what was that, just that core in you that said, this is something I want to try? Yeah.
So what happened was we were flat broke. The phone's not ringing. We honestly had no idea what we were going to do. Like, I did not we had no, I mean, when I say we had nothing. And the phone rang, and it was this guy, Chris Jabe, who I had met one time prior, who had read my book, and he was a friend of a friend. And he was a big kind of like financial mucky muck who had made a bunch of money and had bought a property on the North Shore of Kauai that he was trying to figure out what to do with. And he was like, would you consult for me and help me figure out what to do with this piece of land? Like, maybe you guys could come out to Kauai. It was like the strangest request, because it's not like I have any experience. Like, why is he asking me this? Like, I don't know what to tell this guy. But I think really what he was doing was throwing us a lifeline. He's like, come out to Kauai and, we'll work on some stuff, and, I'll pay you and create a soft landing pad for you. So like within 2 weeks, our family had moved to this organic farm on the North Shore of Kauai, and we were living in yurts, and I was working with this guy, and it was amazing, even if, albeit strange. But after a couple months of being there, because this was some months after Finding Ultra had come out, I started to get a little bit of island fever. I was like, what am I doing out here? Is this really what I'm supposed to be doing? Like, I'm not sure. And I just felt a creative itch. Like, I felt like disconnected from the mainland and this, path that I had been on to try to make something, and being on an island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, I felt like I was hamstrung in my ability to kind of fertilize that soil. And the podcast idea really came out of me just being a fan of the medium. Like, I was somebody who was a very early adopter in terms of being an audience member of podcasts, particularly when I was training for all these races, and I'd be out on, Dotsie, you guys know, like, I'm out on my bike for 5 or 6 hours, and this is pre-iPhone. Like, I couldn't just listen to music, and I didn't want to have nothing the whole time. So I figured out this thing called podcasts, which at the time you had to download on a desktop or a laptop and then bounce them onto an iPod. Like you had to really want to listen to these things, right? Like I was the only person I knew who was listening to podcasts, and I fell in love with them. I thought they were amazing. I couldn't understand why more people weren't into this. And I just listened to thousands of hours of podcasts while I was training and driving around Los Angeles, et cetera. So, it had always fascinated me. And it was a time it was a time where it certainly wasn't cool to have a podcast. Nobody was podcasting. Certainly nobody was making any money podcasting unless you were, I think Adam Carolla and, Joe Rogan had started it. There was comedians who were doing it, but nobody was really doing anything all that compelling in the health and wellness and fitness spaces. And I just thought, I know some cool people, like maybe this could be fun. And so while we were on that Hawaiian island, like I just thought, like, let's give it a whirl. And I spent a day trying to figure out how you do it, and just turned on a microphone and started talking. And Julie and I had a conversation, and I thought, well, that was fun. Like, let's do it tomorrow. There was no agenda. Like, I'm starting a podcast. It was just, I'm bored. And like, this seems like something that's creatively interesting, and let's see how it goes. And it really just, grew from there. Like from the minute we started doing it, I felt comfortable doing it. I really enjoyed it. And it's just, that's kind of all she wrote. Like there hasn't been a week that I've missed ever since that time 9 years ago.
I remember you telling me that when I was asking for some advice. It must have been around the time when we were starting, because this is Alexandra's idea. And I was like, okay, because I was not, and am still not, a consumer of the medium. And I remember asking you, and you said the secret is literally consistency, and that's it. That's it. And so, I mean, it's just probably 4 years ago. It's like, I just didn't ever skip a week.
Right.
And I'm like, that's it. Are you sure? But now that we're in it, whatever, 2.5 years in or something, man, that is just spot on. Just because and with that also comes, right, all of the improvement and all of the richness of it and all of the fun and all of the, messing up and figuring out how to do things better and how to communicate best. And it's, another layer having the two of us. And it's and I think of that often when our numbers stagnate some months. And I think, keep after it, because we love it. I mean, that's obviously the core. Yeah. That you love it. But yeah, consistency is so true, I found.
Yeah, you got to love it. You have to love it. If you don't love it, like the audience is going to know.
Yep.
But as long as you can create a situation that makes it sustainable to do it consistently so that you can continue to love it, that consistency becomes the teacher where you learn all the other stuff that you need to, kind of get better at it. Right. Like as athletes, do you skip workouts? Like,
right.
No, not when you're training for the Olympics. Right. So it's like, okay, well, I don't skip workouts, so I'm not skipping this either. Like, and just showing up for it and learning and getting better and iterating on it every time and allowing it to tell you what it wants to be, because it's kind of an organic, living, breathing thing, have been, kind of lessons for me in doing it.
It was just right off that I was thinking about all the lessons. And I was curious, all the guests that you've had on, there's, brilliant and impactful people in so many facets. But I was curious if there is something that you learned from a guest that was most useful to you.
Oh man, done 650 of these things. It's so hard because it just goes in like a soup, into my brain.
Yeah. It's a good way to put it.
It's hard to like tease out, well, this person said that and that person said this. I mean, the atomic habits thing, I think, is a really powerful, practical thing, from his book. So, that's an easy one to identify. Simple practices tend to stand out from past guests, what's his name? Kamal Ravikant, who has this practice of looking at himself in the mirror and saying, I love you and I forgive you. And like, like little things like that seem hokey are really powerful things that when practiced, consistently, those two, I think would stand out probably the most because they're so tactile.
You must, I think listening is a very important skill, and a lot of us don't have it. I think I could be a better listener. Can you give us any tips on how to be a better listener? I imagine that over the years you've picked up maybe you've picked up some skills in that area outside of your podcast, but because you talk to so many people and your podcasts are several hours long often, it's not like you can just go off. You have to listen to be able to then continue the conversation forward in a manner that gets deeper. So many of us have trouble getting deeper when we see people.
Yeah. Listening is the key to the whole thing. Like it is, for me, the most important piece of podcasting. So how do you become a better listener? I think your ability to listen is tied to a lot of things. It's tied to your ego, because people who are fearful of how they're coming across or afraid about how the conversation is going are going to be less likely to listen. They're going to be the people who jump in and want to tell you about themselves, or are so anxiety ridden about the conversation going off the rails that they're going to be over controlling and they're just looping thoughts in their head. So ego is a big piece. I think mindfulness and meditation practices are key to improving your ability to listen, because if you can be present, then you can listen. If you can't be present, then are you ever actually listening? And I think it's akin to put it in the athlete context. You train really hard for a race or a game, and then you trust that training, and then you show up and you execute, but you don't bring that training with you. Just like you prepare for a podcast guest, you do your research, you do whatever your process is. But then my practice is to literally set it aside. And yes, it's there as a security blanket, but my job now is to just trust that the preparation will play itself out in the way that it's meant to, if I just allow myself to be present for the experience, which means detaching from the ego or some expectation about the direction of the conversation, and treating it more like you would a dinner party conversation. Like you don't go to a dinner party with notes or an expectation of what a conversation with the person next to you is going to be like. And when you're in that conversation, you're not like, what am I going to say next? And how's this conversation going to end? Like you're open to it. You're available to it. So the more that you can get outside of yourself and your expectations and just be with that person, make eye contact with them, focus on what they're saying, and try to, really get calm and centered, the better position you are in to have the kind of conversation that you aspire to have. Now, I think that needs to be calibrated based upon the kind of conversation that you want to have. Like, Alexandra, if you're trying to extract very specific information, like I need these strategies and I need these tools and you need to tell me the plan, like maybe you need notes, and that's fine. That's a conversation that's less about listening and more about like, tell me what you know. And I want to make sure that we cover all of these important topics, versus a more emotional adventure that isn't necessarily linear. And what I've learned, and this is just my own, this is not to say that anybody else should do this or that this should be anybody else's approach, but for me, I think that my strength as a podcaster is not only in my listening, but in creating a space where people feel safe enough to be vulnerable and open up in a way that maybe they don't in other aspects of their life. And the key to that is not only listening, but me trying to figure out what the way in, like, how can I connect with this person emotionally? Like I have to create that connection, and that's going to happen in different ways with different people. But if I can really lock in with this person where they're locked into me and we trust each other, then I know everything is going to be okay. And whatever is meant to be imparted will be imparted.
That's great. Thank you. In real life, do you know when you come across someone that you might not have seen for a little bit? Hey, how you doing? Good. How are you doing? Fine. And then boing, and sometimes I feel like I need to think of something to say that's more personal so that I can deepen this conversation just a little bit instead of us both leaving with fine. So I'll think of something. A lot of times it'll be, well, I visited my mom.
Yeah.
And at least that'll get to something family-like, or something personal. So how do you deal with those? Because I'm sure a lot of people come up to you, Rich, and go, "Hey, Rich, how you doing?" And people whom you might not have seen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it also depends on like whether I'm in a hurry,
Well, yeah.
I'll have a higher tolerance for the quick, awkward, whatever.
Let's say
trying
at a party.
to get somewhere.
Let's say you're at a party.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's great questions that you can ask that shake people out of that like awkward dynamic. And, one that I like to use is like, tell me what you're excited about right now. So it's not like, what do you do for a living, or what? It's just like, what's exciting you, these days? Like, what are you super keyed up about? Or, what are you afraid of right now? Like, what's keeping you up at night? Like things like that just go not too far beneath the surface, especially if you don't know the person that well, but is enough out of left field where they're like, oh, like that's not the normal question that I get. Like maybe this person actually wants to have a real conversation. And it kind of, it's like it just cleans the palate a little bit for something fresh and interesting.
Thank you. That's great. I'm going to use that.
Yeah. I remember, feeling when I was on your past podcast, if we finished, and I would have probably ventured to guess it was like an hour and 15 minutes or something, what it felt like because of how comfortable and how much fun I had. And then it was 3 hours. And I remember looking at you, I'm like, oh my God, that's no one's going to listen to this. That is just, no one wants 3 hours of me. And you're like, trust me. You just looked at me like, it's like, oh yeah, people are they do. They'll, but it was just that complete and utter raw openness of just feeling like I'm having a really interesting conversation with a friend, and you have mastered that. I just want to traverse a little bit about social media and the journey of social media. There's some people love it, some people hate it, many are addicted to it. We're living in a time where it's seemingly doing quite a lot of harm. And did you see the cosmetic company Lush just said no more? They completely got off all social media channels. A cosmetic company that probably sells, I would say probably mostly to 15 to 20-year-old girls. No more. It's enough. Is it a safe place? Is it a good place for activists? Is it a good place to spend how much ever time people that are listening to this podcast might be spending? If you need to just completely go away from it, what might that look like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, we're in a situation where for a lot of us, we can't live with it and we can't live without it. And, I've made a choice to like kind of live my life and pursue this career that's in the public sphere. And there's a utility with social media that's very powerful when used appropriately, but there's no doubt that it is pernicious in its predatory nature. We're all at the behest of these algorithms that are hacking our brains and leading us down strange rabbit holes and, infecting us with, not just ideas, but very, an addictive behavior pattern that keeps us wed to these machines in a manner that is extremely dehumanizing. And as we're seeing, obviously, disruptive and polarizing in terms of how it's dividing us. And it's a very difficult thing. Like the fact that you have like what seems like a very arm's length relationship with it, like you're barely on it, or you only look at it once in a while. Like, God bless you. Like, do you feel like you need to be any different? Like, I think that that's great. Like, I think that, to be liberated from it is to be liberated. And, I'm just like everyone else. I find myself mindlessly scrolling, then thinking, what the hell am I doing? I try to adopt the kind of post and close it and walk away because, as we use it to get the podcast out there. And, I don't post anything unless I feel like it. I don't have rules around like, oh, I have to post this and this is the way we're doing it. Like I refuse to be a prisoner of this thing. Like, well, everybody says you got to do this. It's like, no. Like, I'll throw a photo up for the podcast and, oftentimes that's it. And even if I don't feel like that, I don't feel like I have to do any of that, but I still find myself, as this like, recovering alcoholic with these addictive tendencies, like it just primes my brain, and I find myself incapable of putting it away. And if I can't put it away, what's a, 14-year-old girl supposed to do? I mean, forget about it. So I think we're in this, infancy stage with these incredibly powerful tools that we're very ill-equipped to manage in a very healthy way. And we're seeing the fallout and the disastrous results of this being played out, not just in terms of individual lives, but in mental health more broadly, and in the kind of political division that we're seeing that seems to get exacerbated daily with this breakdown in our ability to have any kind of healthy conversation. And listen, I'm no different. Like I tweeted something the other day and I feel like I played right into somebody else's playbook. And then I was like, why did I do that? And I'm like, I got to get away from all of this stuff. But I think to kind of bring it full circle, when you look at the way that social media kind of fractures communication in so many ways, podcasting is really an antidote to that. Because, prior to, quick broadband speeds, it was impossible to find long form conversations with anyone. We had, a couple channels growing up when we were kids, and we'd watch the news, and interviews were 5 to 10 minutes at most. But now, like if you're a young person and you're curious about a certain subject matter, or you want to, like you're interested in a field, and then here's this expert who's been doing it for 40 years, and he's going to talk for 2 hours about how he crafted a life around that. I mean, what a miracle that exists. Like, I wish that this existed when I was an impressionable young person. So, they are tools, they are utilities. It's really about our relationship to them. And I think it's incumbent upon us to create those boundaries, to establish healthy relationships with them, because short of that, they will undoubtedly use you and you will be consumed by them.
Yeah.
So Rich, what are you excited about right now?
Oh no, you're throwing it right out of me.
I knew she was going to do that.
Tell us what's coming up that you're excited about.
Yeah.
I mean, it's holiday season, so I'm excited. I have like a weird relationship with the holidays. Like I have like this thing, like it's okay. The days are really short. It's dark out. It's cold out. Everything in my body is telling me I need to like rest and hibernate and hide. And yet society's telling us we need to be merry and going to parties and joyful. And I just get angry about all of that. So, but I have kids and I want to provide them with a happy, exciting holiday season. So I'm excited about that. And then I'm taking January off completely to go off grid. So I'm getting ready for that. And I'm very excited about that because I've been working too hard for too long.
Yeah, wonderful.
And what does that mean? Do you just totally monk out, or do you do quite a lot of movement, like ride your bike a ton, run a ton?
Yeah, a ton of that, but like being offline, and not having any obligations or appointments or, commitments to see anybody or to do anything. I need that desperately to reboot the system. And also we have, we put this book out, Voicing Change, last year, which is like a coffee table version of the podcast. So we have a second volume of that that's coming out in the new year. So I'm excited about that too.
And I think Dotsie's in your first version. Isn't that correct?
What's that?
Dotsie's in your
Yes,
first
that's
version.
right. She is. Yes.
Yeah. So everybody, Voicing Change and
Yeah.
Finding Ultra, those should be on your Christmas list this year. And you'll really set yourself up for a terrific 2022. So
Yeah.
Thank you.
We are going to come to a close, but of all of the work that you've done, I this is just my opinion, but I feel like there's a very much a teacher inside of you that comes out on every week. What would you put on a flyer if it were to be seen by the entire world?
I think a good one would be, who are you? Like, isn't that
Question
really the question that we need to be asking ourselves all the time? And perhaps the question that most of us, or a lot of us, have never asked ourselves, because I feel like too many of us are living our lives reactively. We're responding to the stimuli around us, and the busier we are, the less likely we are to engage, with that kind of interior rumination that I think is so important to figuring out what it is that you're here to express and inhabit in your life. So I'm always trying to encourage people to engage in more of that, because that's been my story. Like, it wasn't until I started asking myself that question that I was able to start, making some changes in my life that have led me to this place. And that's question is freely available to everybody. And the way in which you answer it is going to look differently to everybody too, which is why it's kind of like a very, beautiful, broadly applicable question to ask.
Yeah, I love that.
Well, I'm very glad to know a little bit more about who you are. So
yeah,
it's really
we wanted to do that. We're on episode 170, 180 or something. And I don't think we've had one episode where we talked to no plants. I don't know how that happened.
Yeah, it never came up.
This is literally the core of this. I know.
We've had some non-vegan people on, but with a vegan, we've never not talked about plants. So you're a first, Rich.
Wow.
Yeah.
We just didn't get to them, but
that's okay. Everyone's heard that stuff anyway. So
there is an aspect to that, of course, right? And it's kind of like, just go to read the book. Right. Go read the book, people, if you want to hear about rich and plants.
Right.
So thank you so much, Rich,
thank
for being
you.
on the show. We really appreciate it.
Cool.
All right. I appreciate you guys so much. That was super fun. Really honored to spend time with you today. Thank you. And Dotsie, I just had, we just put up an episode with Leah Goldstein, who claims that she raced against you. Do you know this woman?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. She's going to be on our podcast next week, actually.
Oh, she is. Oh, okay.
She's great. We raced for years against each other. And
that's crazy.
And then it kind of helped her with her plants for RAM.
Right.
She was plant-based, and then she kind of went back, and then she, contacted me a couple of years ago and was like, I gotta get back. So it was so cool to reconnect with her. And yeah, what a badass, right? Like,
crazy story. Craziest story. And I just felt like, why doesn't everybody know who this person is? Like this story is so wild. Like when I came across it, I was like, nobody knows who this woman is. And like, she's done all this crazy stuff. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
So that'll be
yeah, she's fierce. Yeah. Good stuff.
Cool.
All right.
Awesome. Thanks, you guys.
Bye.
Happy holidays.
Hey folks. Okay. Back by very popular demand is our plant-powered plate fridge magnet, which you are going to receive for free if you leave us a rating and a review on whatever platform you're listening to this podcast on. So here are the details. Just write your quick review. Does not need to be long, does not need to be a whole story. Just be honest and speak from the heart. Then take a quick screenshot of the review you wrote and email it to us at podcast@switchforgood.org. That's podcast@switchforgood.org. And include your mailing address so we can send you a power plate. We are doing this because the more reviews we garner, the higher we go in search results, which means more folks will learn about our podcast. So the power is in your hands. Leave us a review and zoom, your power plate arrives at your doorstep.
So thank you so much for tuning in today. If we helped you in any way, then click the subscribe button and let's keep hanging out together. We have so much more to share with you.
And if you need more information on actually making the switch for good, please visit us at switchforgood.org for loads of info. And you can subscribe to our mailing list where you will receive all sorts of super cool gifts, discount codes to our very fave dairy-free products, and a lifetime of powerful health tips.
So join us on the journey to switch for good. This is the future.